Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Radical acceptance is not a surrender. It is not serenity dressed in clever language, nor is it the quietism of defeat cloaked in philosophical calm. It is an ontological stance, a refusal to resist the real as it presents itself, even when that reality is fragmented, unjustified, and without resolution. Unlike resignation, which slumps into despair, radical acceptance remains upright. It does not collapse under the weight of circumstance. It leans in with no promise of understanding, no guarantee of change. It does not beautify the unbearable. It abides with it, like standing in wind that never stops asking questions. From the outset, this confronts our craving for meaning. We are narrative creatures, trained to metabolize pain into growth, to sand down the jagged edge of experience with interpretation. Radical acceptance interrupts this metabolism. It is the choice to let what is remain unconverted. This is what makes it radical, not that it is passive, but that it does not need the world to make sense in order to continue. This too, exactly as it is, it says, not with resignation, but with lucidity. A lucidity that is revolt, as Camus might say. A lucidity that neither consoles nor critiques, but holds still. This is the freedom from the known that Krishnamurti described, a moment in which even the need to understand becomes noise. There is no path beyond this, no summit to reach. It is not a process, but a presence. Merton might have called it a prayer, not the kind offered to be answered, but the kind that asks nothing and changes no one, except perhaps the one who remains. In that remaining, a strange dignity emerges, not triumph, not clarity, but a stance, like breath held at the edge of a wound, steady and exposed. Such exposure is not without cost. It dissolves the illusions that tether us to selfhood, continuity, purpose, coherence. What remains is bare, vulnerable. And yet, as Judith Butler reminds us, vulnerability is not the opposite of power. It is the beginning of relation. To accept radically is to re-enter the world not as its owner, but as its witness. Not as hero or victim, but as one who sees and does not turn away. Still, this is not a call to purity. Acceptance is not a moment of enlightenment or the payoff for a spiritual practice. It is recursive, partial, failing often, and yet always beginning again. The only real question is whether one can stand beside the unbearable, not for a moment, but as rhythm, as practice, as refusal to force life to explain itself. To remain is not to consent, it is to attend. The difference matters. Where resignation withdraws, radical acceptance leans in. Not as correction, not as diagnosis, but as an ethic of attention. Attention that does not ask, what does this mean, but what is this? Attention that does not demand a future to justify the present. Simone Weil called this the rarest form of love, a gaze that neither judges nor anticipates, but simply abides. In that gaze lies the beginning of an unguarded life, one that no longer interprets pain as punishment or redemption, but as presence unfiltered. Such a life cannot be measured. It refuses calibration. It does not arc toward betterment or climax in healing. It floats like ash that refuses to settle. This refusal is not rebellion, it is rhythm. To accept radically is to meet the moment without a plan, to stop forcing coherence onto the incoherent. Like Suzuki's beginner's mind, it is the place before naming, before dividing, before setting the terms of engagement. It is not a technology, it cannot be scaled, it has no outcome. It is not useful, and in this uselessness lies its precision. That precision is not analytic, it does not cut through complexity to simplify. It stays with complexity, it watches it shift, it names nothing, not because it cannot, but because it no longer needs to. Anthony de Mello once noted, the suffering is not in what is, but in the want it to be otherwise. Acceptance removes that wanting, not by force, but by proximity. You get close enough to the thing, loss, grief, injustice, failure, that you stop needing it to convert. And yet, the modern self is built on conversion. Growth, healing, transformation, these are the currencies of contemporary life. We spiritualize pain so it feels earned. We narrate adversity so it sounds meaningful. But radical acceptance dismantles this moral economy. It refuses to turn pain into merit. There is no progress here, no prize, only fidelity to what already exists. A moment that does not require your improvement to be valid. This is not passivity. This is not detachment. This is not the muteness of defeat. As Baldwin would insist, this is clarity in the midst of rage. It is what remains when performance ends and explanation recedes. It is what you practice when nothing will change and you're still here, breathing, listening, refusing to make beauty of the broken, yet standing in the room with it, unguarded. Not because it is right, not because it is just, because it is. The third temptation is interpretation, to turn the moment into metaphor, to craft grief into grammar. But some things do not want to be understood. Some experiences resist being rendered into lesson or lineage. Blanchot called this the disaster, not because it is destructive, but because it exceeds containment. It is not the story of what happened. It is what still trembles, unstoried, after the story ends. Radical acceptance does not ask us to decode the disaster. It asks us to remain with it, not to name it, not to share it, just to be there. This being there is neither dramatic nor visible. It leaves no trace. It gathers no audience. It does not signify moral maturity. It cannot be monetized, stylized, or streamed. It is the work you do in silence, with no return. And yet it is also the beginning of a different ethics, one that does not depend on reward, recognition, or even action. It is not an ethic of doing, but of dwelling. Dwelling without remedy. Dwelling with what Judith Butler might call grievability. Not the public mourning of loss, but the private recognition that it exists at all. This form of recognition rarely occurs in language. It appears in gesture, in breath, in presence, in the willingness to sit beside what is unresolvable without trying to fix, uplift, or narrate it into dignity. Dignity, in this sense, is not the outcome of triumph. It is the refusal to alter what is in order to make it more palatable. It is the act of looking directly at pain and not lowering your eyes. It is the moment of stillness where agency is redefined, not as impact but as accompaniment. To accompany is not to advise, it is not to soothe, it is to stay. And staying has become an endangered capacity. In a culture driven by acceleration, optimization, and performative empathy, the ability to remain without agenda is nearly extinct. Radical acceptance revives it, quietly, without program, without flair. As Wendell Berry might note, it is like walking the same path every day, not to get anywhere, but because the path deserves walking. This undeservedness is its own kind of grace. Not religious, not redemptive, but relational. To accept radically is to say, I will not wait for this to be useful before I allow it to exist. I will not silence it because it cannot teach me. I will remain not because I am strong, but because I am still here, and that sometimes is enough. There is a quiet heresy embedded in radical acceptance. It proposes that not all pain must be alchemized. This contradicts the entire architecture of spiritual improvement and psychological development, where trauma is a curriculum, suffering a syllabus, and healing the degree conferred upon completion. But some pain does not graduate, some wounds do not close, not because we failed to grow, but because they were never ours to fix. Gabor Mate might say, we call it coping, but it's often suppression rehearsed into identity. Radical acceptance unlearns that rehearsal, not by replacing it with something more correct, but by ceasing the performance altogether. This cessation is not detachment, it is intimacy. Intimacy without control. To remain with what will never resolve is not to approve it. It is to unfasten yourself from the illusion that you must. This is the beginning of what Nouwen called the cracked vessel, the place where light does not redeem the break, but merely enters through it. Such light is not heroic. It does not illuminate. It flickers. It accompanies. It does not promise clarity. It simply proves presence. And yet even presence is not purity. We cannot live perpetually within radical acceptance. The self recoils. The mind grasps. The desire to turn pain into story returns like tide. This is why acceptance is not a state. It is a rhythm that returns each time we abandon it. A rhythm, as Rilke would say, that teaches us to live the questions, not answer them. Each return is a form of practice, not to get better at it, but to remember what it asks of us, not brilliance, not insight, just non-resistance. Non-resistance is not compliance. It is what remains when you stop arguing with what already is. This is different from agreement, different from submission. It is simply the refusal to replace reality with reaction. Arne Næss might call this ecological humility, a way of being that does not rearrange the world to feel safe in it. It listens to what is. It accepts the species of thought and experience that do not evolve. Such listening includes absurdity. Zadie Smith reminds us some things are accepted not because they're meaningful, but because they're ridiculous and real. We do not need to agree with reality, we do not need to like it, we do not need to use it, we just need to stop editing it into acceptability. And once we do, what's left is not truth, not beauty, not closure, but contact. And contact in the end is the beginning of everything that matters. Radical acceptance, then, is not a strategy. It is not what you do when nothing else works. It is what you return to when everything else insists on working. Every narrative, every system of belief, every posture of healing, it all proposes movement, transformation, becoming. But there is a different wisdom in stillness, a deeper fidelity in staying. Staying not because you are anchored, but because you refuse to drift into performance. Staying not for meaning, not for virtue, not for witness, but because there is nowhere else to go that would be more honest. This honesty is not confessional, it is structural. It says, the world is like this, and I am here, not above it, not enlightened by it, not crushed beneath it, just here. It is the end of commentary. As Blanchot would frame it, the real catastrophe is not what happens, but that it happened. And radical acceptance means allowing even that unspoken thing, the one with no arc, no closure, no witness, to count as real. Not worthy, not instructive, just real. Like a memory that no one else shares, but still shapes your breath when the room falls quiet. In this way, radical acceptance shifts the definition of agency. It moves us from the realm of action to the realm of stance. Vanier spoke of dignity as the condition in which nothing more must be proven. That is the crux. Acceptance affirms dignity not through mastery, but through non-denial. It lets the moment be unredeemed and still necessary, the pain unhealed and still valid, the event misunderstood and still definitive. And through this, it reveals that the truest form of presence is one that demands nothing in return, not even coherence. To demand coherence is to push the moment into shape. But what if the moment is shapeless? What if it does not arrive to complete us, teach us, or break us open? What if it is just here, like a bird seen only once, or a voice in a hallway that no one else hears? Acceptance makes room for these moments, not by naming them sacred, but by refusing to discard them. They are not transitions, they are not metaphors, they are not catalysts, they are events. And events do not have to be beautiful to matter. So let them remain, let them sit beside you, let them say nothing, let them explain nothing, let them ruin your expectations of what pain should become. And when you find yourself asking what the point of it all was, return to this. The point is that it happened, and you remained. To remain is to refute, not in the sense of protest, but in the deeper refusal to distort. In staying with what is untranslatable, unearned, and unresolved, one disrupts the dominant logic of utility. Not everything needs to be used. Not every moment must be metabolized. This, in its own way, is a critique of late therapeutic culture, the way even our interiority has become a marketplace of outcomes. John O'Donohue might call this a desecration of presence, the idea that being must justify itself through transformation. Radical acceptance restores the sacred to what's simply there. But to restore the sacred does not mean to explain it. There are moments that should remain undescribed, not because they are beyond language, but because language would only shrink them. This is where poetry begins, and also where philosophy learns to pause. In that pause, there is something like forgiveness, not the moral kind, not even the interpersonal kind, but the forgiveness of reality for not being more than it is. That forgiveness does not resolve pain. It does not elevate suffering. It simply clears the space in which they are allowed to stand undisturbed. And standing is the final act. Not rising above, not breaking through, not emerging stronger. Just standing with what is broken, with what is unjustified, with what will never become myth. And in this standing, something shifts. Not the pain, not the world, but the relationship between them. Jean Vanier reminds us that to become human is not to overcome fragility, but to move closer to it. Closer, not because it instructs, but because it reminds us that presence is not earned, it is offered. And to accept radically is to receive without needing to possess. In this receiving, grace flickers, not as reward, not as closure, but as tone, a slight easing, a breath that does not struggle. Radical acceptance does not reveal itself all at once. It arrives in fragments, in refusals, in brief flickers of non-resistance that dissolve just as they're noticed. It is less a state than a series of micro-acts, pausing before interpretation, softening the instinct to solve, staying silent when explanation tugs at the tongue. It's not dramatic, it's not visible, but it is traceable, like fingerprints on glass, long after the hand has gone. These traces do not build a philosophy, they mark a way of being that doesn't try to become anything else. Each moment it appears, something is disarmed, not just the grasping for meaning, but the posture of entitlement to meaning, the entitlement to redemption, to closure, to transformation. These are not ethical demands, they are aesthetic preferences masquerading as moral truths. And radical acceptance withdraws from them without scorn. It simply steps aside, allowing the thing itself to persist without revision. It does not ask the moment to rise to the occasion. It meets it as it slouches, crumbles, remains. This does not make it passive. It makes it precise. It does not blur injustice or romanticize harm. It simply refuses to extract symbolic value from them. It does not call broken things beautiful. It does not call pain a gift. It does not repackage the unbearable in language that flatters the one who endured it. It says, this happened. And that is enough. Enoughness is a radical ethic, especially in cultures that reward perseverance only when it yields insight or productivity or recovery. Here, to accept radically is to divest from the cult of resilience, to say, I do not need this to make me stronger. I do not need to turn this into anything. I will not mine this for wisdom. I will not reframe this as growth. I will simply stay, not out of defeat, not out of virtue, but because staying is what reality asks of me. Staying does not fix, staying does not justify, staying does not lead to anything, but it confirms something quietly vital, that even what does not evolve is still part of the world, still part of experience, still part of us. And in accepting that, with no halo, no arc, no reward, we make space for a kind of truth that does not uplift but does not lie either. The truth that presence by itself is not the beginning of anything, it is the whole of it. There is no closure in radical acceptance, but there is form, not the form of progression, but the form of recurrence, of a return that holds shape without building toward anything. This is its strange fidelity. It loops without resolving, it lands without finishing. And in that structure, something quietly dignified begins to take hold. Not because it elevates, but because it does not abandon. Not because it concludes, but because it stays. To stay at this depth is to forfeit momentum. You remain not because you must, not because you've been changed, but because remaining is what the moment still calls for. The world hasn't shifted, the grief hasn't lessened, the story hasn't resolved, but your relationship to it is quieted, not silenced, not settled, just quieted, like water in a bowl that no longer needs to ripple. And in that stillness, no final line is offered, no final image, no upward turn, just one more breath held alongside the truth that nothing may come next, one more decision not to force a shape where there is none, one more sentence that resists the temptation to complete what cannot be completed. I am still here, not despite it, not because of it, just with it. Still. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode was digitally narrated by Holly, who helps bring our ideas to life. And thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. They help us reach more people like you.